I read a story about a clergywoman with cerebral palsy, or CP for short. She was oftentimes consumed with negative self-talk, she confesses. She muttered to herself, "I've caused this, I'm broken, I caused my parents so much extra work, /money, /time, I'm imperfect, I don't belong in this world, this is too difficult, why would God do this? God must hate me." And on and on this negative self-talk went. She confessed that even as a person who was fairly well adjusted to life with disability, she still dwelled upon these sorts of things. And she added, church didn't always help. In her experience, the church responded to her disability in one of three different reliable ways. Someone would inevitably say to her, "God made you this way because God knew you were special enough or strong enough to handle it." Someone else would say, "Well, you have a disability because of the sin that exists in our world. You are an example of what original sin can do." Someone else would try to explain it this way: God made a mistake. Something clearly happened. Now, the clergywoman with CP insisted all three of these justifications were said to her face. Now, I imagine she handled each encounter diplomatically, as a good pastor would, but she wanted to respond like this. She wrote, "I'm not strong, nor am I special. If this is what strong and special looks like, you can have it." She added, "Why am I an example of original sin? I mean, I didn't do anything to deserve this." She added, "I thought God didn't make mistakes. Is God imperfect, or weak, or flawed somehow?" So obviously the church's theology on disability leaves a bit to be desired. There has to be a way to approach disability from a theological perspective that does not involve shame, or sin, or mistakes. A number of smart theologians have tried to reshape thinking about this matter. One theologian I read about insists that disability is not a sort of imperfection or mistake. She insists that it is something deliberately, intentionally given to us by God. And yes, this deserves a second glance. She wrote, "It is something deliberately, intentionally given to us by God." Now, I have to admit, her statement may be hard to swallow for both able-bodied and the disabled. Disability sure looks like a mistake to us, but the theologian wonders, is it a mistake from God's perspective? The pastor with CP chooses to believe that her cerebral palsy was given to her with purpose. How then is her CP a mistake, she wonders. Yet churches still struggle to embrace a better theology, from one that fosters shame. Now, it's true that some pastors and Christian leaders and churches think that they've progressed, yet their language oftentimes still betrays them. And so they tell the disabled, "You're made in the image of God, too." Too, says the pastor with CP? No. People with disabilities are made in the image of God, period. There is no two. So we can plainly see that the theology of disabled folks still needs more additional work. The thing is, theology has a practical, in-life, real-life dimension. It does not only merely occupy the minds of thinkers and scholars and such, it should shape hearts and compel us to do something, anything. I learned a new term. The term dyspraxia is sometimes applied to a failure to turn one's theological statements into action. So it becomes clear to see that churches run the risk of being guilty of two different, separate failings in regards to disabilities. Churches can be accused of perpetuating faulty theologies, perhaps. Or, second one, not adapting practices to new or emerging theologies. Now, the consequences for these two infractions are serious. People with disabilities experience a form of prejudice called ableism. Similar to racism, ageism, and sexism, which divide us by characteristics over which we have no control, ableism is based on the assumption that there is such a thing as normal, and some of us fall outside that range and are thus, well, abnormal, strange, odd, peculiar, and even repellent. Thus, those who are abnormal are excluded from community and religious life, when the abled refuse to make accommodations for the disabled and regard them as other or outsider. When people with disabilities are written off as they over there or those people, and the terms we and us are reserved for the temporarily able-bodied and able-minded 80% of the population, the body of Christ is broken and ultimately impoverished without them. This, of course, has no place in Christendom, yet it has persisted for centuries. How do we combat it? How do we move into inclusion and even full participation? I invite you to stay tuned and find out. Hi, this is Pastor Don Shipley. I'm delighted to have Harriet Wilkin here with us today. Harriet, please introduce yourself. Hi.
Thank you, Don, for inviting me to this time. My name is Harriet Wilkin. I am currently a licensed local pastor in the Pacific Northwest Conference. I am pastoring Castle Rock United Methodist Church and Grays River United Methodist Church.
I want to talk a little bit about disabilities, so tell us your qualifications and backgrounds in regards to that, please.
Yes, my grandmother, when she was older in life, she ended up in a wheelchair, and she could not attend worship in person because the church was not set up. And this is going back into the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s. She was not able to attend in person. And so my grandfather and my grandmother would stay at home on Sundays and watch TV, church on TV, but they still supported their local congregation. They were United Methodist, and they still supported their local church, even though they couldn't attend in person.
Aside from accessibility, were there other reasons you pursued disability ministries?
I started working more with children and youth in the church. I noticed that the curriculum just wasn't set up correctly to accommodate different learning styles.
What was the consequence of the inadequate curriculum?
I kept noticing how people were being left out and placed on the margins. As a pastor, I continuously notice this.
Who is a person with a disability, or what exactly constitutes a disability?
According to the CDC, 26% of adults in the United States have some type of disability. When we think about disability, it ranges from a learning disability that some might refer to as dyslexia or some type of learning difference. And then there's also developmental disabilities, physical disabilities, and also mental health.
Can you offer a description of some of these disabilities?
For learning disabilities, as I mentioned, it's the learning style that might be different. And most of the times it's relating to language and reading and math. Developmental disabilities range from ADHD, some know as ADD, or those who are on the autism spectrum. And sometimes a disability also includes a hearing loss, or it's something that develops over time, maybe after an accident.
So there are a myriad of disabilities, those that are visible and a number that are invisible.
So there's actually a long list of those who qualify under a disability.
What is the preferred terminology? Should we use the word physically challenged or differently abled versus disabled?
It depends on the person, and these terms continue to change.
Disabled advocates insist there's a distinction between person first and identity first. Person first would be the man who is blind, versus identity first, which is the blind man. Can you clarify the distinction?
Person first versus identity first. Do you want to be considered a person who is blind, or you want to say that blind person? You want to be careful, because you want to recognize the person who they are.
I think I now understand the distinction. What we're really getting at is one's identity is not defined by one's disability.
We're saying that people have disabilities. We're all created in the image of God, and we all have different abilities, and we all have different gifts.
Disability advocates promote full inclusion and full participation. Can you tell me what the difference is?
Inclusion means that all the proper things have been in place. We've done the accessibility audit, things are there, but can people really be participating and involved?
How was disability treated in the Old Testament?
What most people don't realize is that the perception and how we treat people with disabilities goes back to Leviticus chapters 11 through 17 and Numbers chapter 19, where it is laid out about the purity codes and laws that were established.
So our biases and prejudices and such are rooted in these old ancient texts?
Very much so.
Okay. With only a couple exceptions, the Old Testament condemned those with disabilities. Was the New Testament a bit more enlightened?
In John chapter 9, we learn that the disciples say to Jesus, and they ask this question, who sinned for this man or his parents that this man was born blind? And Jesus replies with, neither this man nor parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. And because it was the idea that, especially coming from the Old Testament and going back to those Leviticus texts, that it was part of sin that a person end up having a disability.
So Jesus was a revolutionary. A new thing was happening.
All those that had been marginalized and been considered unclean and been considered outcasts of society because of what the Leviticus text had set up, Jesus comes along and says, no, all are welcome. And I am going to go to those who have been marginalized. I am going to go to be a part of their community. And he welcomes them all. And he welcomes people who are bringing their loved ones to him. For instance, in Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, we know of a man who was paralyzed. And his friends bring him to Jesus. And, well, they were trying to bring him to Jesus, and yet they couldn't fit in. They couldn't get into the house or the building that Jesus was there at. And so they went up to the roof and cut a hole and lowered their friend down in so that Jesus could heal their friend. Jesus comes to those who have been pushed aside and marginalized and been outcast by society and says, no, you are welcome. I love you. You're my children.
One would think that Jesus' example would inspire modern churches to be welcoming and hospitable to those with disabilities. But is that true?
Unfortunately, it's not. We have made an environment in the church that is not always welcoming. People who have come into a sanctuary with a child with autism or some sort of disability, and because the child started to act out, they were asked to leave the sanctuary.
There seems to be rules of conduct and decorum for either adults or for children. And if either adults or children can't meet those because of their disabilities, they're urged to leave. Is that about right?
a lot of that goes back to, can you sit still? Don't move. Again, and what we consider to be normal, is that perception of, well, I can do this, why can't you? This is the way we've always done it. Why do we need to change?
Well, this is discouraging. But meanwhile, United Methodist churches promote themselves as having open doors. Is that true? Is that your experience?
We're making lots of improvements by more pastors speaking up. There's several pastors who have come forward mentioning what disability they have and taking interest in the disability ministries and recognizing what changes need to occur. And sometimes it's from people who are attending realizing, oh, there's people who are missing that are not part of our congregation. What do we need to do to make changes? So we're slowly getting better at it, but we still have a long way to go.
Church leaders oftentimes say it's just too cost prohibitive to be accommodating for everyone.
Cost has become quite the factor, and when we look at budgets, how would you like to participate in worship in any of these events? What if you couldn't enter a building? Would you expect something to change? And I understand the hesitation of looking at a budget, of saying we can't afford. But then I ask, how can we not afford to do this? Or we can continue to marginalize people, say that they are not welcome in our buildings.
There's a phrase I coined that I often use, which is our lives are enriched by the company we keep. It seems to me that if we deprive people of access to our church facility or our ministries, we are impoverishing ourselves. Would you agree?
I would agree. We lose out from gaining knowledge and wisdom. When I learned of all those who have dyslexia, and it's very interesting to see in reading back to all the different famous people who have dyslexia or been diagnosed with dyslexia at some point in their life. There's some really famous people. Albert Einstein is one of those people. And there's many others. What if we had said to him, oh, you can't do that? So when you say to a person with a disability, oh, you can't do that, you're taking something that God has given them the ability to do away from them. They have a gift. They might be great at business. They might be great at accounting. They might be great at science. They might be great at different things. And if we say no, we are saying that we don't recognize them as one of God's children.
Right. Especially gifted and endowed by God to do something remarkable. Mm-hmm. We're now all sort of affected by this conversation, and we're wondering, what do we do next? What do you suggest we do?
I encourage you to read several books. I would encourage you to hear the stories. I would encourage you to sit with a person and persons with multiple different types of disabilities and hear their story. Hear the story of how they've been marginalized in society, how they have not been able to be a part of a community of faith, and they want to praise and worship God just as much as you do. Hear their story. Hear how they have been rejected by the church, but yet been created by God. What does it mean to love your neighbor?
What scriptures inform or inspire you?
Matthew chapter 19. The disciples are saying, no, keep the children away. Jesus doesn't have time for them.
Right.
And Jesus says, no, let the children come unto me.
It speaks of inclusion and welcoming, doesn't it? What hymn or song inspires you?
Well, since I grew up in the church, I know a lot of old hymns, but one of my favorites is Morning Has Broken.
How come?
Each morning is a new day. Each morning, God has something more to reveal to us. Each day, we can learn something new from His scriptures.
So it's a new day tomorrow, and we encounter somebody who is disabled. What do we do again?
It's accepting who they are. It's accepting that they are a person with feelings, a person with abilities.
I think what we're getting at is that when tomorrow comes and we encounter somebody who is disabled, we'll regard that person as a beloved child of God, a person of sacred worth, that our perceptions need to change, right?
It's that perception of, well, they're in a wheelchair, they can't do that, or they have a disability, oh, they can't do that, or whatever it might be. If you're just looking at the person and making the judgment of their ability, but not hearing what lights them up, what gives them energy, what they enjoy doing, it's like the idea of putting that light under a basket.
Yes, in regards to baskets, the world has systematically obscured the lights of those who are disabled by placing baskets over them. The church has an obligation to remove those baskets so that their light can shine. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Maria, thank you very much for this conversation. It certainly has been enriching and challenging. And yet, there's a necessity here. If we are to be, in fact, the body of Christ, comprised of every living being on earth, then we need to find ways to open our hearts and our thoughts to those who are disabled. So thank you very much for the conversation.
And thank you for having me.
God bless you.
Blessings to you.
Dear airport man, I am aware that I am blind, so you don't have to shout, 'cause I can hear you just fine. And thanks for the card, but I don't need a ride unless you're gonna let me take the wheel. Dear server, at every restaurant, you don't have to ask my friend what I want. I can speak for myself. Friend, what do I want? It all looks so good to me.